Huh? I think I'm working now. Y'all hear me okay? Yeah, they got me. It says I got 2. Okay. That's so cool that y'all can tell how much battery life I got up. You know, I just thought that was something only I knew. But evidently it's not. So we got some double A's up here. If it goes down, I'll change it out. Kind of one of them wet, dreary days. I hope you made most of it. We got some visitors with us that are staying at the campground. Is it number 2 campground? Yep. I said they're doing fine out there. It's not bad. I guess if you've got a mobile home or something, you can just hang out in there and be just happy. I got to do something cool today. I went up to Graymere Church of Christ and spent some time with Andrew Phillips, their preaching minister, and Chad Landman. They've been doing a podcast since back of March this year, and invited me to come over and record a couple of different sessions, and then I'm going to go back and do a third session. And then I just because I happened to be there, he had somebody cancel on him. Andrew's teaching a D-Min, a Doctrine of Ministry class at Freed-Hardeman University, and he's like, "Hey, I've had a cancellation for the guy who's supposed to come in and kind of get interviewed. What you doing about 10:30 in the morning?" I said, "Well, I'll be there on Zoom. We'll make this happen." So that's interesting. But the podcast is called Connections. You can find it on YouTube, and if you have Spotify, you can type in Connections on the podcast, and you can find that podcast on there. And he's interviewed a lot of different preachers and folks since about March. So it's just something him and Chad have been doing, and it's pretty good. So what I didn't know when I was telling Jim this, what I didn't know is that you're also getting videoed. I was picturing it's just being listened to, but for YouTube, it's also video. So the only thing that got my head on that is as I was driving over, I noticed that these brand new pants I bought are evidently bleached weird. Something's weird about them. You can't tell from a distance, but if you get up close, it gets weird. And it kind of got in my head a little bit. But I forgot about it once we got to talking, you know. Okay, that's cool. I think I'm okay. I think we might get lucky and make this. All right, so as you can see, we're talking about something nobody wants to talk about. All right? I don't know of any. I mean, there are some preachers that love to talk about it, I guess, but there's uncomfortable realities afoot when you're dealing with this. But we hear wrath and we associate with wrathfulness a lot of negativity, and I get that because, frankly, when it comes to the exercise of human wrath and anger, well, there's just a trail of blood and tears and, crime. And when you get this concept applied to God, it's hard for folks not to, try to find a way around that. Surely that's not the case. But we've tried to clarify some things along the way that wrath is an expression of God's holiness against sin, okay, and evil. And it must be that way because God's character is such that He can't stomach sin. He can't be tempted to sin. He has the strong aversion to sin. And so, and of course, the challenge for us is to try to share His perspective on sin. And we really struggle to consistently sustain that kind of perspective, right? Because sometimes we get selfish. And sometimes we want to do what we want to do when we want to do it, however we want to do it. And we lose, perhaps, that perspective. God never loses that perspective on just how disgusting and vile and terrible that sin is, whatever form it takes. Okay, what we've been doing is looking at God's wrath in the Torah, and I've got just a couple of things I want to highlight very quickly as we wrap that discussion up. For those who weren't here, we marched right through each book of the Torah, highlighting instances where God's wrath was manifested in some shape, form, or fashion. The first manifestation of it happens pretty early, about Genesis 3, when he bans the first couple from the Garden of Eden. Okay, we see it in a big way at the flood, Genesis chapter 6, and probably the biggest, if you're looking at the books, the one that has more instances of his wrath is probably the book of Numbers. That's where a lot of complaining's going on, a lot of murmuring's going on, a lot of rebellion is going on, and it just, Numbers is lit up with instances of God's wrath. We said last week as we ended that, although I don't know of anybody in their right mind that would want to do this, but if you ever needed to know how to kindle God's wrath, there's three ways, at least from Genesis or from the first 5 books of the Bible. You could do it by idolatry. You can do it by being rebellious, obstinate, stiff-necked, disobedient, and you could do it by. There was a third one. I know there was a third one. Presumption. Look, he's got the notes. I got the notes too, but I didn't. He beat me. But you can be presumptuous. We gave Nadab and Abihu that as an illustration, where we presume that for instance, God will just be okay with what we do, and then you find out no, he wasn't okay. You knew that what you were doing was not something that God would want you to do, but you did it presuming he would just let it go and not pay attention to it, right? And it cost them. Here's just a few other things. God's wrath as instruction. What is it? What are some points that God's wrath drives home for us? I think the first one is the seriousness of sin. Okay, that's pretty clear. If you had a human race to care for, and one of the things you needed that human race to understand was the seriousness of sin, what is maybe a few ways, what is one way to maybe go about demonstrating the seriousness of sin? That is bringing upon people consequences for their sin. Expressions of wrath show us, God has a holy aversion to sin. And if that's true, if our Creator and Sustainer and, Redeemer is, since he is so against sin, then maybe that, should show us just how serious it is. The other thing we get about God too is his holiness. This is really a big point in the book of Leviticus. We've mentioned this, that you think about God saying, I want to be in the middle of them. We have them constructing that tabernacle at the end of Exodus, and then I'm going to get right in the middle of camp. Well, that's awesome, but that's also kind of a scary proposition if you are a human being who is not holy like God. And then you try to, why are all these different laws that are prescribed, and why is there all this holiness code stuff that's prescribed? Why are there all these rituals and ceremonies around this tabernacle? It's because if you get too close to the sun, right, and you're not prepared to be, you're going to get burned. And he has to kind of protect himself, protect the people from himself in a way, given that vast chasm between who he is and his nature and holiness and who they are, right? So, and then another thing I think we see, and probably your best sort of foreshadowing of this in the Torah is Moses. And that's where we remember all the times that God's like, Moses, I'm about to wipe them all out. And what does Moses do? He kind of serves as a type of Jesus, doesn't he? He comes in between God and the people and says, I know that they are idiots. But please don't do this. Remember your covenant. Remember the promises, and you see this mediation that takes place on so many occasions. And that's instructive for us as well. That's all this stuff right here, right? All of these concepts are all going to converge at the cross. All of this and some more things that we'll pick up on. Here is, what about these 3 T's, y'all? Don't you ever say, I can't do some alliteration sometimes, right? The Torah's typological trajectory. Man, I'm proud of that. But it's also kind of nerdy, And so what are we talking about here? Well, that's the whole type, antitype. You have the type in the Old Testament. You have the sort of the antitype that comes true in the New Testament. So you got baptism is an antitype of kind of the flood water and the salvation that took place there and how we're saved by baptism in the present and all of that. So here's just a few things along those lines. The Torah sets the stage for understanding Christ as the ultimate wrath bearer. Okay? This is like right smack in the middle of the Torah, which happens to be the middle of the book of Leviticus. Leviticus 16 is a discussion of the Day of Atonement, right? And you remember, there are 2 goats, right? One goat is going to get slaughtered, and the other goat's going to get what? They confess the sins on, and then they do what? They call it the scapegoat, and that goat goes running off into the middle of nowhere. Really, both of these things are kind of typological of Jesus, the Lamb of God. And we know when we get to the New Testament that Jesus soaked up, as it were, the wrath of God so that you and I would not have to. Okay? He was made sin. He was made to be sin for us. Another part here, the Torah Leviticus foreshadows Christ as the ultimate sacrifice for atonement. Same concept here, just a little different. It's got a prism in front of you, and we're looking at one side, now we're going to look at another side. Atonement is at one-ment. How do we become one, right, with God? Christ is going to be the answer to that. And then also the Torah prefigures in a variety of places the ultimate punishment, which is hell. And that is for those who remain skeptical, who remain stubborn, and who are seditious. From sedition, who are insubordinate, who are not willing to acknowledge who God is, love God, and follow God. And so that's just some things the Torah does. Now we're going to switch, and what we want to get into tonight is God's wrath in the conquest of Canaan. Okay? This is really important. It's an important discussion. America's most well-known critic of Christianity in the late 1700s and early 1800s was Thomas Paine. He was one of only a handful of America's founding fathers who did not claim to be a Christian. Okay? He called the God of the Old Testament the Mars of the Jews, the fighting God of Israel, who was, and I quote from Paine, boisterous, contemptible, and vulgar. 2 centuries later, Richard Dawkins, arguably the most famous atheist in the world today, published his book, The God Delusion, which soon became a New York Times bestseller. And one of the most oft-quoted excerpts from this work comes from page 31 of The God Delusion. And this is where Dawkins provides his own description of the Lord from the Old Testament. He says, and I quote, please know, I did not say this, okay, just to be clear. I am going to quote Richard Dawkins. I really don't want to have anything to do with the origin of this quote. I'll just tell you. But here's what he said. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. So you notice what he did there, don't you? He just called this fictitious, right? Mythical, legendary. But then he says, jealous and proud of it. Petty. A petty, unjust, unforgiven control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. That is how Richard Dawkins describes the God of the Old Testament. And he affirms that Joshua's destruction of Jericho, for instance, is, and I quote, morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacres of the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. The late Christopher Hitchen, in his book God Is Not Great, says that the Canaanites were, and I quote, piteously driven out of their homes to make room for the ungrateful and mutinous children of Israel. So, as Christians who uphold, or should uphold all of Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, how might we respond to those who would characterize God as a moral monster, basically, on the basis of God commanding His people to exterminate the Canaanites? Okay? Was that campaign immoral? You know, what was this campaign? Is this indistinguishable from what Hitler did in Nazi Germany? And I want to seek to demonstrate that God's actions in Israel's conquest of Canaan were in perfect harmony with His character, which can be variously described as, yes, merciful and gracious and long-suffering, but also just and holy, and at times wrathful. All right, so let's think just a little bit. I got to streamline this because there's a lot of material we can cover, but I want to try to stay on pace here. But I do want to make sure that we understand that what we have here is an account of what happened in one of the incursions in the Promised Land, okay? What the Israelites did to a segment of the population in Canaan. But every person they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. So, here is where the Israelites do in fact kill other human beings, end the lives of other human beings. What we need to see is that their killing of these other human beings was not divorced from a command of God. In other words, we want to establish that God ultimately stood behind what happened to these Canaanites, which, some would say, well, that's not what you should do. What you should do, preacher, is just say, we just had some crazy Israelites who were bloodthirsty go in there, right? And just start slaughtering people. And God was like, what are y'all doing? You can't do this. Well, that's not the truth of the matter. In fact, Joshua 9:24 makes it pretty clear that God commanded the Israelites to, and I quote, destroy all the inhabitants of the land. The original command came via Moses from the Lord. You will find this in Deuteronomy 7, back in Deuteronomy 7, verse 1, 2, when they're looking forward to what eventually Joshua is going to get to do in the conquest of Canaan, right? And here's what we have. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them or show no mercy to them. You shall utterly overthrow them, from the greatest to the least, or we might say from the oldest to the what? To the youngest. So, passages like that in the Old Testament clearly indicate that the responsibility for this extreme measure rested with God rather than with the Israelites. The Israelites were carrying out the command, the expectation, the will of God. And that's where atheists and folks say, what else is there to say? How can you worship a God who commanded the extermination of these people? Because when you begin to chart through Joshua, you kind of get to Jericho and you got Ai. I mean, there is kind of this repeat. They killed everybody, right? Everyone that breathed, and so a lot of people refer to this. They use the word genocide, right? Or they might use the word ethnic cleansing, which kind of prejudices people against God. And this is where things get kind of tricky, but Eric Lyons of Apologetics Press, he pointed out that it was genocide in the sense that it was a planned, systematic, limited extermination of a number of nation states from a relatively small area in the Middle East. But he is quick to point out that it was not a war against a particular race or ethnic group. Some would say, who cares? People died. But here's the thing. This was not a random genocide, ethnic cleansing of a group of people. The question, and this is why this is good to discuss this under the umbrella of God's wrath. And if you've been here in previous lessons and just in what we started with, ask yourself, when you read through the Torah, when does God's wrath come out? What is His wrath intended to stop? It's 3 letters, y'all. Sin. And He is the judge of all the earth. Right? So that's the point that doesn't get discussed. I want to bring this up because it's really, really important. When I say doesn't get discussed, this is where, atheists and others want to kind of stay out of the worldview of the Bible in order to critique God. But here's the thing, if you're going to level a critique against God by using the Bible, right? You're like, I want to use the Bible to show you why I'm not going to worship God, and you better not worship God. Let's look at it. Okay, if you're going to take your critique from the Bible, I also get to use the Bible to provide a response to your critique. Does that make sense? Hey, if you're going to pull it from the Bible and put it out there for people to gawk at and look at, fine. But you need to understand that, well, one thing is, barring the repentance of Richard Dawkins, I would not want to be Richard Dawkins on the day I come face to face with Yahweh. Especially in light of some of the things he said about Yahweh. Right? Is that what you want to do? Yeah, I wrote that. It was on page 31 of my book. Well, did you fully understand what you were writing about? Let's get into the worldview of the Bible and let's see what we discover here, right? Now, there's been some interesting ways that people have dealt with this. I've mentioned Marcion to you on several occasions. Marcion was labeled a heretic in the mid-2nd century, and the reason is he said, you guys can keep that Old Testament God. That is like, I don't like him. I like the God of the New Testament. So he just like ripped the Old Testament out of his Bible, and also in his canon, anything in the New Testament that praised or connected to the God of the Old Testament in any significant way, what did he do? Rip that out too. He drove a wedge between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. Origen, who was a 3rd century theologian, what he decided to do with these passages of the conquest of Canaan at the behest of God is he decided to say that these passages actually did not record historical events, that they were all allegories, and that you don't need to take them literal, but they are teaching like a spiritual truth to us about God's aversion to sin or whatever, and he would allegorize those passages to get around this perceived problem that we find in the Old Testament. I do not believe that either one of those resolutions is acceptable. And so for me, the thing that is pivotal in this discussion is to keep in mind, right, that what happened in Canaan in the book of Joshua was the judgment of God in space and time. Okay? And so let's illustrate that. There's 4 points that I usually like to share here in kind of providing a biblical response to a quote-unquote biblical problem that atheists like to bring to the table. One is we have to affirm that an otherwise loving, merciful God can justly administer punishment to evildoers. Even we might put a word in front of the word punishment, capital punishment. This is similar to how otherwise merciful parents, policemen, and judges can justly administer punishment to rule breakers and evildoers. Just as they can do that, so too can God. Of course, God metes out punishment on a grander scale than those that we just listed. Okay? Loving parents have administered corporal punishment. There's probably a good bet that it's not as prevalent today as it used. Used to, you know this, guys. I'd say not all of you know this. Some of you are so young, this is going to blow your mind, what I'm about to say. But believe it or not, there was a time where they could take you out in the hall at school and paddle you with a piece of wood. Right? Well, I felt it. I love Miss Lyles. I was in her 2nd grade class, and I was in her 5th grade class. And she just, I guess once a year, I'm not saying it was arbitrary, she'd just take us all out in the hallway and paddle the whole class one after the other and send us back into our seats. Maybe we were getting loud, and instead of trying to single out who was doing what, all of you get out in the hallway, and we all got paddled, right? My dad had a Rottweiler belt. That's what it was. It was a belt, but it had a Rottweiler on the buckle of that belt. Kind of an intimidating piece of material, right? And again, I know we're kind of starting from the lesser and working up to the greater. Policemen who are constantly saving the lives of innocent people, protecting the lives of innocent people, have the authority both from God and the government to perhaps unalive, as they say these days, wicked men who might be in the process of murdering other people, right? And then I think about, judges, just judges, have the authority to sentence, for instance, a depraved serial child rapist to death. Loving kindness and corporal or even capital punishment are not antithetical to one another. And as we've seen, God is both kind and severe. So that's the point there that you have to wrestle with. Another thing is this, and this is the part that often doesn't get in the discussions of those that almost want to make you think that, well, these were just family-loving, good, agricultural, farming people in Palestine who are just, good old country folks, good people, decent people. And then here God comes and says, well, my people want your land. I want my people to have your land. So we're going to have to go ahead and just kill all of you. You have to understand that the Canaanites, on the whole, were a horrifically wicked people. Now, we don't have time to go and read, for instance, Leviticus 18 verses 1 through 24. We get into Deuteronomy 9, 1 through 5, chapter 18 verses 9 through 14. But even by ancient standards, the Canaanites were a hideously nasty bunch. Their culture was grossly immoral and decadent to the roots. Its debauchery was dictated primarily by its fertility religion that was tied to eroticism and all varieties, to the successful agrarian cycles of planting and harvest. So they had divination, witchcraft, they had female and male temple sex. Their Canaanite idolatry encompassed a host of morally disgusting practices that mimicked the sexual perverse conduct of the Canaanite deities. There was adultery, homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, bestiality, incest. And if that's not enough, if you're like, well, I can stomach all of that. I don't know how you can. But if that's not enough, they also practiced child sacrifice. Upwards to 4-year-old children. You would have the big Molech bull, the outstretched arms, kind of at a slant with a big opening in the belly, get the fire raging in there. You put your kid on the arms, whether that's a baby or a 4-year-old, and you watch them roll down into the belly of the beast, as it were. These were the kinds of practices that were going on routinely among the Canaanites in that society. They were so nefarious that God said they defiled the land. And because the land could stomach them no longer, the land vomited out its inhabitants. See, here's the thing. This thing gets me. if you can understand to some extent why God sent the flood in Genesis 6, then you can understand why God commanded what He commanded in this particular instance. Now, I realize the medium was different. In Genesis 6, we have what? This worldwide flood that comes on the earth. He didn't get Noah and a race of like really skillful warriors and say, all right, guys, I need y'all to go out there, right? And I need you to start slaughtering people. He sent a flood and took out the world. But in this locality, in this general place, it's not like God was looking to destroy the whole human race on this occasion. He was looking to take out a particular society of people in a particular location. And the reason why He wanted to take them out is because of this right here. The other thing that also doesn't get mentioned in this context, and I know that was the first bell, is that yes, God used the Israelites to punish the Canaanites for their wickedness, but only after 4 centuries had passed. God is not a foolish, impulsive, capricious, quick-tempered deity. We know from other passages that He is in fact slow to anger. That doesn't mean He never reaches anger, right? He is slow to anger. Like we've said, He's long of nose, to get literal in the Hebrew. It takes Him a long time, as it were. But once He has exhausted His patience, better watch out. In Genesis 15:16, and I want you to think about this, what happens in the interim. This is in Genesis 15:16. Do you guys know who He's talking to on this occasion? Abraham. He's having a conversation with Abraham, the patriarch Abraham. And God spoke with Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorites, and Amorites, by the way, was such a numerous and powerful tribe in Canaan at that time that they kind of came to stand as for the whole. God said to Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet complete. So that it appears that in Abraham's day, the inhabitants of Canaan were not so degenerate that God would bring judgment upon them at that time. However, by the time of Joshua, which spans 4 centuries, okay, how long ago was, I love this because this just helps people appreciate the span of 400 centuries. How long ago was 1776 that we get together and celebrate on July 4th? Was that 400 years ago? Not quite. But I'll tell you right now, when I think about George Washington, I'm like, that was a long time ago. And that is true, but that's not, 400 years is a long time.